Welcome to UCounsel. Can a landlord be held liable for the wrongdoing of its tenant which caused some injury or damage to a third party? This is the question that we're going to address in this lecture, and the answer to that question is, in certain circumstances, the answer is yes. And if you want to hear more about how and why, we'll explain that in the lecture. We begin with our usual disclaimer that this lecture is not legal advice, so if you have any specific questions, you should contact a lawyer or a paralegal or the Law Society of Ontario for any referral. Now, this question was brought to the court in Ontario Court of Appeal, and the decision in this case called Youssef versus Misselbrook, and the decision just recently came out in early February, and the case is quite relevant for landlords with respect to their liabilities or potential liabilities to third party. So what happened in this case? The landlord owned a farm property. It rented the farm property to a tenant, and the purpose was that it could use it as a farm or raise domestic animals. The tenant had kept 5 donkeys, 5 mules on the property. The property had a fence and a gate, and the gate was unlocked, and one could pry the gate open by force. In this case, one police officer was able to push the gate open alone, and so that was the circumstances of the gate. 5 donkeys, which were owned by the tenant, were that they escaped from the farm through that gate and onto the adjacent road. And the plaintiff, Youssef in this case, he was riding his motorcycle in that area. It was early in the morning, around 3 a.m., and he struck one of the donkeys and sustained very serious injuries. So Youssef then ended up suing the tenant and the landlord for damages. So what did the landlord say? Prior to this case, it is well known that it is rare that landlord would be held liable for the wrongdoing of its tenant, especially when the landlord is not on the property. Landlord does not have a day-to-day control of the premises, and tenant is the only one using the property. But in this case, the landlord admitted responsibility for the maintenance of the fence. That was a fact that they admitted, and they never withdrew that admission. Having said that, they argued that keeping the gates locked and preventing the animals from escaping was solely the responsibility of the tenant, because those were tenant's donkeys, and tenant had the use and control of the premises. Landlord said that they had no presence on the property. Right? And so accordingly, the landlord argued that they had no duty of care. Remember the concept of duty of care that we have explained in our lectures on tort? So it's the same concept. Then they argued that they had no duty of care and they had no statutory obligation. So only the tenant ought to be held liable. And with respect to duty of care, there was sort of a subsidiary argument. The motions judge, who had made the decision earlier, the judge held that the lease was governed by Residential Tenancies Act, and Residential Tenancies Act has a provision that requires landlord to be responsible for the maintenance of fence and certain other areas of the property. But the landlord argued that this was a lease that was governed by, it was a commercial lease and governed by commercial tenancies and not Residential Tenancies Act, and therefore the duty of care that was held to be on part of the landlord was incorrect. So what did the court say? The court ruling was, court first confirmed that landlord admitted the responsibility for the condition of the fence. That was sort of the primary admission. And then this responsibility required the landlord to conduct regular inspections and repairs. And in fact, there was evidence from the past that the landlord did in fact inspected the property and the fence on certain occasions and carried out certain repairs as well. And then the court held that the landlord failed to notice that the gate adjacent to a road was unlocked. And then finally, because the landlord had admitted responsibility for the condition of the fence, the court held that it made no difference whether the lease was residential or commercial, because they had that obligation. And on that basis, the court said landlord is liable. So landlord is liable even though it was the tenant's donkeys that caused injuries to Mr. Youssef. Now, what is it that you want to take away from this lecture? Number one, obviously, that there could be circumstances in which if you are the landlord and you're not on the property and you're given the control of property entirely to the tenant, there may be circumstances in which, because of tenant's negligence, you may be held liable, or you may have direct duty of care or obligations towards a third party. You also want to notice that if you read Residential Tenancies Act, it does import certain obligations on the landlord for the maintenance of its property, specifically fences and some other areas of the property. So that obligation cannot be passed on to tenant, and it's landlord's obligation. And if there is an injury to a third party because of landlord's failure to maintain the property or those areas of property, then the landlord will be held liable to the third party. So something to note. Also, what you want to make sure is that in leases, if there are responsibilities divided between landlord and tenant within the statutory framework, then those responsibilities are clearly defined. And if you require indemnification from the tenant in certain circumstances, then those clauses are there. Those kind of clauses are usually already present in commercial leases. Now, also, I believe that it will make sense for the landlord to monitor the rental property appropriately for its usage because of this case. There may be circumstances where if the landlord is not monitoring the property and there is some damage to a third party, it may be held liable. And finally, if there are ways to obtain insurance coverage for certain cases like these, then it may be a good idea to explore those. I don't know if insurance coverage can be provided in some circumstances, but something to explore and see if you have appropriate insurance coverage for your property. Thank you for watching.